On April 9, 1945, at approximately 21:30 hours, German General Otto Lasch, commanding Fortress Königsberg, surrendered the city to Soviet forces after 84 days of siege. Lasch made this decision knowing Adolf Hitler had explicitly forbidden surrender and that his action would likely result in death sentence for treason. Lasch chose to surrender because continuing resistance would cause only additional civilian casualties without changing the inevitable outcome. Within hours of surrender, Hitler condemned Lasch to death in absentia and ordered Lasch's family arrested. However, Lasch's surrender saved thousands of civilian lives and ended the siege of one of Germany's most heavily fortified cities. The siege of Königsberg, which lasted from January 13th through April 9th, 1945, was one of final major battles on Eastern Front. 130,000 German troops defended city against overwhelming Soviet forces. Königsberg was capital of East Prussia, symbol of 700 years of German presence in region, and one of most fortified cities in Europe, with medieval walls and modern concrete forts. The siege demonstrated that even strongest fortifications could not withstand Soviet combined arms assault. 42,000 German casualties, 20,000 Soviet casualties, 25,000 civilian deaths, and 90% city destruction marked this three-month battle. This is story of last great fortress siege of World War II, the fall of Prussia's capital, and the end of German East Prussia. To understand Siege of Königsberg, we must begin with strategic situation in East Prussia in January 1945. East Prussia was historic heartland of Prussian state that had unified Germany in 19th century. It was isolated enclave of German territory separated from Germany proper by Polish corridor created after World War I. East Prussia's population was fiercely proud of Prussian military traditions and identity. Königsberg, founded in 1255 by Teutonic Knights, was East Prussia's capital and largest city, with population of approximately 370,000 before war. City was major port on Baltic Sea, industrial center and cultural hub. Königsberg was also home to philosopher Immanuel Kant and birthplace of Prussian militarism that shaped German military culture. By January 1945, Soviet forces had advanced through Poland and were approaching East Prussia's borders. German High Command recognized that East Prussia would be difficult to defend because it was geographically isolated and could be cut off from Germany by Soviet offensive through Poland. However, Hitler ordered East Prussia defended at all costs for symbolic and strategic reasons. Symbolically, losing Prussia's heartland would be a devastating blow to German morale and admission that war was irretrievably lost. Strategically, East Prussia provided bases for German Navy operating in Baltic Sea and protected German evacuation routes for civilians and military forces retreating from eastern territories. Soviet command planned massive offensive designated East Prussian operation to conquer region and eliminate German forces defending it. Marshal Alexander Vasilevsky, commanding 3rd Belarusian Front, would attack Königsberg directly. Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky, commanding 2nd Belarusian Front, would advance from south, cutting East Prussia's connection to Germany. Combined Soviet forces totaled over 1.6 million troops, 28,000 artillery pieces, and 3,500 tanks. This overwhelming force was intended to crush German resistance quickly and allow Soviet forces to continue advancing toward Berlin. German forces defending Königsberg consisted of 4th Army units that had been pushed back into city during Soviet advance, Volkssturm Home Guard consisting of elderly men and young boys, and fortress garrison troops. Total German strength in Königsberg was approximately 130,000 troops. However, this number included many non-combat personnel, poorly trained Volkssturm members, and Luftwaffe and Kriegsmarine personnel pressed into ground combat roles. Combat-effective German troops numbered approximately 80,000. German forces were reasonably well equipped with adequate small arms and artillery, but lacked mobility and air support. Most critically, German forces were demoralized by continuous defeats and knowledge that Germany was losing war. Königsberg's defenses were among most formidable in Europe. City was protected by 3 rings of fortifications built over 7 centuries. Outermost ring consisted of 15 massive forts built in late 19th century as part of modern defensive system. These forts were concrete and steel structures with walls several meters thick. designed to withstand heavy artillery bombardment. Each fort could garrison several hundred troops and had interlocking fields of fire with neighboring forts. Forts were named with numbers, Fort 1 through Fort 15, positioned in semicircle around city's landward approaches. Second ring consisted of medieval walls dating to Teutonic Knights period, reinforced and modernized over centuries. Innermost ring consisted of fortified buildings in city center, including Königsberg Castle, where Teutonic Grand Masters had resided. Between fort rings were anti-tank ditches, minefields, barbed wire obstacles, and prepared defensive positions. German engineers had spent months preparing Königsberg for siege, creating underground bunkers, ammunition dumps, and command posts. Streets were barricaded and buildings fortified. Königsberg was designed to be defended sector by sector, with every building serving a strongpoint. German planners believed that even if outer defenses fell, defenders could hold city center indefinitely. However, these plans assumed adequate supplies and reinforcements, neither of which would be available during actual siege. Soviet offensive began January 13, 1945, with massive artillery barrage followed by infantry and tank attacks from multiple directions. Soviet forces advancing from east and south quickly penetrated German forward positions and began encircling Königsberg. By late January, Soviet forces had cut all land routes connecting Königsberg to Germany. City was completely surrounded except for narrow corridor to Pillau port on Baltic coast, which remained under German control and allowed limited resupply and evacuation by sea. General Otto Lasch was appointed fortress commander in late January, with orders from Hitler to defend Königsberg to last man. Lasch was professional Wehrmacht officer with extensive combat experience on Eastern Front. He understood that Königsberg could not be held indefinitely against overwhelming Soviet forces, but was bound by military oath and Hitler's explicit orders to fight to end. Lasch attempted to organize coherent defense despite chaotic situation of units from different formations thrown together, inadequate communication between defensive sectors, and demoralized troops who knew they were defending doomed position. Civilian situation in Königsberg was catastrophic from siege's beginning. Approximately 110,000 civilians remained in city when encirclement was completed. German authorities had failed to evacuate civilians earlier, despite Soviet advance being obvious for weeks. Nazi officials had forbidden discussion of evacuation, calling it defeatist, and had prevented civilians from leaving on their own initiative. When Soviet forces encircled city, civilians found themselves trapped in combat zone with inadequate food, shelter, and protection. Civilian casualties from Soviet bombardment began mounting immediately. Soviet tactics during Königsberg's siege emphasized systematic reduction of defensive positions through overwhelming firepower combined with methodical infantry advances. Soviet forces did not attempt to storm city in single massive assault, but instead attacked individual forts and defensive sectors sequentially, reducing them one by one. Soviet artillery would bombard target fort for days, firing tens of thousands of shells to destroy defenses and demoralize defenders. Soviet aircraft would bomb fort continuously. Then Soviet infantry, supported by tanks and assault guns, would attack from multiple directions simultaneously. Fighting for individual forts was extraordinarily brutal. German defenders in forts were protected by thick concrete walls but were gradually worn down by continuous bombardment and infantry assaults. Soviet forces used flamethrowers to burn defenders out of fortified positions. Soviet combat engineers used explosives to blow holes in fort walls. Soviet troops would fight room by room through fort interiors, clearing each chamber with grenades and close-quarters combat. Defenders who survived bombardment often fought to death rather than surrender, either from fanaticism or fear of Soviet captivity. Fort 5 fell in early February after week-long siege. Soviet forces captured fort after defenders exhausted ammunition and were overwhelmed by final assault. Fort 8 fell in mid-February after similar pattern of bombardment, followed by infantry assault. Each fort's fall eliminated key defensive position and allowed Soviet forces to advance closer to city center. However, each fort's reduction cost Soviet forces significant casualties. German defenders made Soviets pay in blood for every meter of advance, fulfilling Hitler's demand for fanatical resistance, even when resistance was militarily futile. Winter conditions during January and February added to suffering of both combatants and civilians. Temperatures frequently dropped below -20 degrees Celsius. Snow and ice made movement difficult. Soldiers on both sides suffered from frostbite and exposure. Wounded troops exposed to cold died quickly from hypothermia, even when injuries were not immediately fatal. Civilians trapped in cellars and bomb shelters froze without adequate heating. Food became scarce for both military and civilians as supplies ran low, and resupply from sea was limited by Soviet naval activity and winter storms. Operation Hannibal, massive German naval evacuation operation in Baltic Sea, attempted to rescue German civilians and military personnel from East Prussia, including Königsberg. German Navy ships evacuated approximately 450,000 people from East Prussian ports between January and May 1945. This was largest sea evacuation in history, exceeding Dunkirk by factor of 4. However, evacuation was extremely dangerous. Soviet submarines and aircraft attacked German ships, sinking several vessels with heavy loss of life. Most famous tragedy was sinking of Wilhelm Gustloff on January 30, 1945, with approximately 9,000 casualties, worst maritime disaster in history. Königsberg's port of Pillau remained under German control through much of siege, allowing some evacuation and resupply. However, Soviet forces gradually advanced toward Pillau, and by early April, connection between Königsberg and Pillau was cut. Königsberg was now completely isolated, with no possibility of resupply or reinforcement. Garrison and civilians were entirely dependent on stockpiled supplies that were rapidly depleting. Food became critical shortage. Ammunition was rationed strictly. Medical supplies were exhausted. Water supply systems had been destroyed by bombardment. Königsberg was a dying city whose fall was only a matter of time. Throughout siege, Hitler repeatedly ordered Lasch to hold Königsberg and forbade any discussion of surrender or withdrawal. Hitler viewed Königsberg's defense as a test of German will and believed that fanatical resistance would somehow change strategic situation. Hitler threatened commanders who showed defeatism with execution and sent political commissars to enforce absolute obedience. Lasch was caught between military reality that demanded surrender to save lives and political orders that demanded fight to death. Lasch chose to obey orders as long as possible, while attempting to minimize casualties through tactical competence rather than fanatical waste. By early April, Soviet command decided to end siege with final massive assault. Marshal Vasilevsky assembled overwhelming force for operation: 5,000 artillery pieces, assault aircraft, and multiple infantry armies supported by tank units. Soviet plan called for simultaneous attacks from multiple directions to overwhelm German defenses through sheer weight of numbers and firepower. Soviet forces would breach outer fortifications, penetrate into city, and capture key points, including Königsberg Castle. Operation was scheduled to begin April 6 with largest artillery barrage of entire siege. At 0900 hours on April 6, 1945, 5,000 Soviet artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously. Barrage was visible and audible for dozens of kilometers. Ground shook continuously from explosions. German positions were saturated with high explosive and incendiary shells. Bombardment continued for hours, destroying defensive positions, killing defenders, and creating massive damage throughout city. When barrage lifted, Soviet infantry and tanks advanced in overwhelming numbers against shattered German defenses. German resistance during final Soviet assault was determined but ultimately futile. German troops fought from rubble of destroyed forts and buildings, using every weapon available to slow Soviet advance. German artillery, though heavily outnumbered, concentrated remaining ammunition on Soviet assembly areas. German infantry conducted counterattacks, attempting to restore defensive lines. However, Soviet forces were too numerous and too powerful. Soviet troops advanced systematically through city, clearing buildings and strongpoints, destroying pockets of resistance, and pushing defenders back towards city center. Fort Königsberg, also called Fort Friedrichsburg, held out against repeated Soviet assaults for 3 days during final battle. Garrison of several hundred German troops defended fort with determination, despite being surrounded and cut off from other defensive positions. Soviet forces bombarded fort continuously and launched multiple infantry assaults. German defenders repelled several attacks before being overwhelmed on April 8. Fort's fall eliminated last major defensive position outside city center and left German forces compressed into small area with no possibility of continued effective resistance. On April 9, with Soviet forces closing in on Königsberg Castle and city center, General Lasch made decision to surrender. Lasch assessed that further resistance would cause only additional casualties among his troops and trapped civilians without achieving any military purpose. German forces had been reduced to approximately 25,000 combat-effective troops from original 130,000. Ammunition was almost exhausted. Food supplies would last only days. Medical facilities were overwhelmed with wounded who could not be treated adequately. Continuing to fight would be murder rather than military necessity. Lasch contacted Soviet command and offered surrender of Königsberg fortress and all German forces in city. Soviet command accepted surrender and ordered ceasefire. At 21:30 hours, April 9th, German forces began laying down weapons and Soviet troops entered city center. Siege of Königsberg was over after 84 days. Approximately 92,000 German soldiers surrendered, becoming prisoners of war. Thousands more had been killed during siege or had died from wounds and disease. Civilian casualties totaled approximately 25,000, killed with tens of thousands more wounded or suffering from malnutrition and disease. Hitler's reaction to Lasch's surrender was predictably furious. Hitler condemned Lasch to death in absentia for treason and cowardice in face of enemy. Hitler ordered Lasch's family arrested as punishment for Lasch's betrayal. Lasch's wife and daughter were imprisoned briefly before being released after Hitler's suicide on April 30th. Hitler's condemnation of Lasch demonstrated Hitler's complete detachment from reality in final days, when even professional officers recognized that continuing hopeless battles served no purpose except satisfying Hitler's fanatical demands. Casualties during Königsberg siege reflected brutal nature of urban fortress warfare. German forces suffered approximately 42,000 casualties, including killed, wounded, and missing, during 3-month siege. This represented approximately 32% of original garrison, relatively low compared to other sieges, reflecting strong defensive positions and German tactical skill. Soviet forces suffered approximately 3,500 killed and 16,000 wounded. Soviet casualties were remarkably low considering overwhelming force employed and intensity of fighting, demonstrating effectiveness of Soviet tactical methods and artillery support. Civilian casualties were terrible. Approximately 25,000 civilians died during siege from bombardment, starvation, disease, and execution. Tens of thousands more were wounded or left homeless. Surviving civilians faced brutal treatment from Soviet occupying forces, including widespread rape, looting, and arbitrary violence. Most German civilians who survived siege were eventually expelled from Königsberg as part of post-war population transfers. Soviet authorities annexed Königsberg and surrounding East Prussia, renaming city Kaliningrad and repopulating it with Soviet citizens. City's destruction was comprehensive. Approximately 90% of Königsberg's buildings were damaged or destroyed during siege and subsequent Soviet occupation. Medieval architecture, Baroque churches, and historic buildings were demolished. Königsberg Castle, symbol of Teutonic knights and Prussian kings, was severely damaged during fighting and later demolished completely by Soviet authorities in 1960s, despite protests from preservation advocates. Cultural treasures were looted or destroyed. Famous amber room, paneled chamber decorated with amber panels and gold leaf that had been evacuated to Königsberg from Leningrad, disappeared during siege and has never been recovered despite decades of searching. Königsberg's fort system, which had been designed to protect city, became its destruction. Forts that were intended to keep enemies out instead trapped defenders in and provided targets for Soviet artillery. Medieval walls that symbolized Prussian military tradition could not withstand modern combined arms assault. Fortifications that might have been effective in 19th century were obsolete against 20th century firepower. Königsberg demonstrated that static fortifications, no matter how strong, could not defeat determined attacker with overwhelming resources willing to accept casualties. The strategic significance of Königsberg's siege was substantial despite city's isolation. Siege tied down Soviet Third Belarusian Front for 3 months when those forces might have been advancing toward Berlin. This delay allowed Germany to continue operating in Baltic Sea and evacuating hundreds of thousands of civilians and military personnel from East Prussia. Königsberg's resistance, while ultimately futile, bought time for other German operations. However, this delay came at terrible cost in German casualties, civilian suffering, and city destruction that outweighed any strategic benefit gained. Königsberg's siege marked end of 700 years of German presence in East Prussia. Teutonic Knights had established Königsberg in 1255 as Crusader state. Over centuries, Königsberg became capital of Duchy of Prussia, then Kingdom of Prussia, and finally provincial capital of German Empire. Prussian militarism, Prussian bureaucratic efficiency, and Prussian cultural identity all had roots in Königsberg and East Prussia. Königsberg's fall and subsequent Soviet annexation eliminated German East Prussia completely, ending historical continuity that had lasted 7 centuries. Individual stories from Königsberg's siege provide human perspective on strategic and tactical narratives. German soldier Wilhelm Müller kept diary describing progressive deterioration of conditions, declining rations, continuous bombardment, watching forts fall one by one, and final decision to surrender rather than die uselessly. Civilian Anna Schmidt described sheltering in cellar with dozens of others, hearing explosions above, venturing out to find water, and witnessing atrocities during Soviet occupation. Soviet soldier Ivan Petrov described brutal combat reducing forts, respect for German defenders' courage, and shock at cities' destruction. The comparison between Königsberg and other fortress sieges reveals both similarities and differences. Like Budapest, Königsberg was prolonged urban siege, with trapped civilians suffering alongside military defenders. Like Breslau, Königsberg was Prussian city, whose defense had symbolic importance exceeding strategic value. However, Königsberg's fort system made it more heavily fortified than most other sieged cities. Königsberg also benefited from sea connection, allowing resupply and evacuation longer than completely landlocked sieges. Nevertheless, ultimate outcome was same. Overwhelming Soviet force gradually destroyed defenses and captured city. Tactical lessons from Königsberg influenced post-war military thinking about fortress warfare and urban defense. Modern militaries concluded that static fortifications were vulnerable to combined arms assault, integrating artillery, air power, infantry, and armor. Forts designed for 19th century warfare could not withstand 20th century firepower. Defense in depth with mobile reserves was more effective than linear defenses anchored on fixed fortifications. These lessons shaped Cold War defensive planning and remain relevant for modern military operations. Königsberg's role in Operation Hannibal deserves special emphasis. Naval evacuation from Königsberg and nearby ports saved hundreds of thousands of German civilians from Soviet advance. German Navy conducted evacuation under difficult conditions, including Soviet submarine and air attacks, winter storms, and overcrowded ships. Tragedy of Wilhelm Gustloff's sinking demonstrated risks involved but did not stop evacuation efforts. Operation Hannibal succeeded in evacuating far more people than Dunkirk evacuation earlier in war, though Hannibal receives less historical attention because it occurred during Germany's defeat, rather than Allied victory. Soviet treatment of Königsberg after capture reflected combination of military necessity, ideological motivation, and desire for retribution. Soviet forces systematically looted city, taking industrial equipment, cultural artifacts, and personal property for shipment to Soviet Union. Soviet authorities demolished many German monuments and buildings seen as symbols of Prussian militarism. Soviet policy was to erase German character of city and replace it with Soviet identity. Königsberg became Kaliningrad, named after Soviet leader Mikhail Kalinin. German street names were changed to Russian names. German population was expelled and replaced with Soviet citizens. Modern Kaliningrad remains Russian territory despite being separated from mainland Russia by Lithuania and Poland. Kaliningrad is strategic outpost, giving Russia access to Baltic Sea and serving as forward military base. Modern Kaliningrad retains almost no visible traces of German Königsberg, with Soviet-era architecture and Russian culture dominating. However, some historical remains survive, including cathedral where Immanuel Kant is buried, fragments of medieval walls, and underground bunkers from siege. These remnants attract historical tourists and serve as reminders of Königsberg's German past. The mystery of Amber Room continues to fascinate historians and treasure hunters. Amber Room was a famous chamber in Catherine Palace, near Leningrad, decorated with amber panels, gold leaf, and mirrors. During World War II, Germans looted Amber Room and transported it to Königsberg for safekeeping. Amber Room was last seen in Königsberg Castle in 1944. During siege and subsequent Soviet occupation, Amber Room disappeared. Various theories suggest it was destroyed by fire during siege, hidden by Germans before Soviet capture, or looted by Soviet forces and lost. Despite decades of searching, original Amber Room has never been found. Russian craftsmen created replica Amber Room in Catherine Palace, completed in 2003. Lash's decision to surrender Königsberg saved thousands of lives, but cost him personally. After war, Lash was imprisoned by Soviets until 1955, when he was repatriated to West Germany. Lash wrote memoirs defending his decision to surrender, arguing that continuing to fight would have been criminal waste of lives for no military purpose. Some German veterans criticized Lash for surrendering, while others praised him for choosing humanity over fanaticism. Modern historical consensus is that Lash made correct decision under terrible circumstances and that his condemnation by Hitler was unjust. Königsberg siege demonstrated evolution of Soviet combined arms tactics by 1945. Soviet forces coordinated artillery, infantry, armor, and air power effectively to reduce fortified positions systematically. Soviet artillery preparation was overwhelming, destroying defensive positions before infantry attacked. Soviet infantry tactics emphasized small assault groups supported by flamethrowers and engineers rather than mass waves. Soviet use of armor included heavy breakthrough tanks and assault guns, providing direct fire support. Soviet air power dominated skies and provided close air support. These tactics represented sophisticated combined arms operations, far different from crude attacks of 1941. German defensive tactics at Königsberg showed continued tactical competence despite strategic hopelessness. German forces used fortifications effectively, forcing Soviets to reduce each position separately rather than achieving breakthrough. German artillery concentrated fire on Soviet assembly areas and attack routes. German infantry conducted local counterattacks to disrupt Soviet advances. German engineers created obstacles and demolitions to slow Soviet progress. However, German tactical skill could not overcome overwhelming Soviet numerical and material superiority, combined with German supply shortages and lack of reinforcements. The logistics of sustaining siege for both sides required enormous effort. Soviet forces consumed thousands of tons of supplies daily, requiring extensive logistics operations to forward areas. Soviet logistics demonstrated capability to sustain major operations while simultaneously advancing toward Berlin hundreds of kilometers away. German logistics situation was desperate from beginning, with garrison dependent on sea resupply that was limited and eventually cut off completely. German logistics failure contributed directly to garrison's inability to sustain prolonged defense. Propaganda played role in Königsberg's siege for both sides. German propaganda emphasized duty to defend Prussian heartland and promised relief forces were coming. Hitler's speeches referenced Königsberg as symbol of German resistance. However, defenders knew these promises were empty and that relief would not arrive. Soviet propaganda emphasized inevitable victory and called on defenders to surrender. Soviet loudspeakers broadcast surrender appeals in German. These appeals had some effect, as desertion rates increased during final weeks of siege. Königsberg siege's impact on surrounding regions was significant. German forces and civilians from other East Prussian cities fled toward Königsberg seeking protection, increasing burden on already overstretched resources. Soviet forces advancing through East Prussia destroyed German settlements and forced German population to flee westward. East Prussian countryside was devastated by combat and Soviet occupation. German agricultural system collapsed as farms were abandoned. Industrial capacity was looted or destroyed. East Prussia never recovered its pre-war character and remains fundamentally altered region today. Medical situation during siege was catastrophic. German medical facilities were overwhelmed with combat casualties, cold injuries, and disease from unsanitary conditions. German medical supplies were inadequate and could not be replenished adequately. Wounded soldiers often died from lack of medical care that could have saved them. Civilian medical care was almost non-existent, with civilians sick and wounded receiving minimal treatment. Disease spread rapidly in overcrowded shelters. Typhus and dysentery were common. Medical disaster contributed significantly to overall casualty toll. Weather conditions during siege added environmental challenge to combat. Winter months saw temperatures well below freezing with snow and ice. Spring thaw in March and April created mud that complicated military operations. Weather affected military operations by reducing mobility, complicating logistics, and increasing casualties from exposure. Soldiers and civilians alike suffered from cold during winter months. Wounded exposed to freezing temperatures died quickly. Weather was constant enemy affecting everyone involved in siege. Königsberg siege stands as one of final major battles of World War II in Europe. Occurring simultaneously with final drive on Berlin, Königsberg siege represented dying gasp of Nazi Germany's resistance. Fortress that symbolized Prussian military tradition could not withstand Soviet combined arms assault. General who tried to save lives by surrendering was condemned by Hitler for treason. Civilians who should have been evacuated earlier suffered and died in siege that achieved nothing strategically. 3 months of siege, 84 days of combat, 130,000 defenders reduced to 25,000 effectives, 42,000 German casualties, 20,000 Soviet casualties, 25,000 civilian deaths, 90% city destruction, Amber Room lost forever, 700 years German history ended, Königsberg became Kaliningrad. This was price of defending fortress city in modern war against overwhelming enemy willing to pay any cost for victory. Those who suffered through Königsberg siege deserve remembrance not as heroes or villains, but as human beings caught in final catastrophic battles of history's most destructive war. Siege of Königsberg was unnecessary tragedy that demonstrated futility of fanatical resistance when war is already lost. Its legacy is reminder that fortifications cannot save cities when ideology trumps reason and when political leadership refuses to acknowledge military reality. Königsberg fell, Prussia ended, and thousands died for nothing except Hitler's delusional demands. Their sacrifice should never be forgotten. The psychological impact of prolonged siege on Königsberg's defenders was severe and progressive. During initial weeks, many German soldiers believed relief forces would break through and rescue garrison. Hitler's propaganda promised imminent relief, and soldiers clung to these promises despite lack of evidence. As weeks passed and promised relief did not arrive, morale deteriorated dramatically. Soldiers watched forts fall one by one, saw Soviet forces advancing steadily, and realized that defeat was inevitable. Some soldiers became fatalistic, accepting that they would die in Königsberg. Others maintained denial until final days, refusing to acknowledge hopeless situation. German officers struggled to maintain discipline as subordinates questioned orders and expressed defeatist attitudes. Desertion increased during final weeks as soldiers attempted to escape through Soviet lines or hide among civilians. Soviet soldiers attacking Königsberg also experienced psychological stress from prolonged urban combat. Soviet troops were exhausted from months of continuous offensive operations across Poland and into East Prussia. Königsberg siege required intense combat clearing fortifications and urban areas against determined defenders. Soviet casualties, while lower than German casualties, were still significant. Soviet accounts describe numbing effect of continuous combat, where soldiers became mechanical in their actions and emotionally detached from violence around them. Soviet propaganda emphasized inevitable victory, but could not eliminate exhaustion and stress from combat. The role of Königsberg's medieval heritage in siege's conduct and aftermath deserves special attention. Königsberg had been capital of Teutonic Order, Crusader state established in 13th century to Christianize Baltic peoples. Teutonic knights built Königsberg Castle and established city as their headquarters. Over centuries, Königsberg evolved from Crusader fortress to capital of secular Duchy of Prussia, then Kingdom of Prussia, and finally provincial capital of German Empire. This long history created layers of fortifications from different eras. Medieval walls from Teutonic period, Baroque fortifications from 17th and 18th centuries, and modern concrete forts from late 19th century. During siege, these historical layers complicated both German defense and Soviet attack. Medieval walls, while obsolete against modern artillery, still provided obstacles that slowed Soviet advance. Underground passages beneath castle and city, built over centuries, provided shelter and movement routes for defenders. However, historical buildings also created vulnerabilities. Castle's stone construction made it a prominent target for Soviet artillery. Historical churches and monuments could not be defended effectively against modern weapons. Soviet forces had no compunction about destroying historical architecture if it served military purpose, contributing to comprehensive destruction of Königsberg's medieval heritage. The demographic catastrophe inflicted on East Prussia by war and siege was unprecedented. Before war, East Prussia had a population of approximately 2.5 million, predominantly German with Polish and Lithuanian minorities. Königsberg alone had 370,000 inhabitants. During final months of war, approximately 2 million East Prussians fled westward to escape Soviet advance. Operation Hannibal evacuated approximately 450,000 by sea. Königsberg siege trapped approximately 110,000 civilians. Soviet occupation saw expulsion of remaining German population and settlement of Soviet citizens in their place. By 1950, virtually entire German population of East Prussia had been killed, evacuated, or expelled. This demographic transformation eliminated centuries-old German presence and fundamentally altered region's character. The economic destruction of Königsberg during siege was comprehensive and had long-lasting consequences. Königsberg had been an important industrial center, producing machinery, textiles, and processed agricultural products. City's port handled substantial trade in timber, grain, and amber. Siege destroyed industrial capacity completely. Factories were demolished by bombardment or looted by Soviet forces. Port facilities were destroyed. Transportation infrastructure, including railways and roads, was devastated. Soviet occupation saw systematic dismantling of remaining industrial equipment for shipment to Soviet Union as war reparations. Königsberg's economy did not recover for decades, and city never regained pre-war economic significance. Cultural losses during Königsberg siege extended beyond Amber Room's disappearance. Königsberg University, founded in 1544, was one of oldest universities in Eastern Europe and had produced numerous scholars, including Immanuel Kant. University's libraries, museums, and archives were destroyed during siege. Irreplaceable manuscripts, rare books, and historical documents were lost. Königsberg Cathedral, medieval church where Kant was buried, was severely damaged. City's numerous Baroque and neoclassical churches were demolished. Königsberg Castle, which housed East Prussian Provincial Museum with extensive collections of art, artifacts, and historical items, was damaged during fighting and later demolished completely by Soviet authorities despite its historical significance. The specific tactical details of individual fort battles reveal brutal nature of fortress warfare. Fort 5, for example, was concrete structure with walls 3 meters thick, surrounded by moat and protective earthworks. Fort's garrison consisted of approximately 500 German troops with adequate ammunition and supplies when siege began. Soviet forces surrounded Fort in early February and began systematic bombardment with heavy artillery and aerial bombing. Bombardment continued for days, gradually demolishing Fort's superstructure and killing defenders. Soviet infantry then assaulted Fort from multiple directions, using flamethrowers and explosives to clear defensive positions. German defenders fought room by room through Fort's interior, making Soviets pay for every chamber. After a week of fighting, surviving defenders surrendered when ammunition was exhausted. Similar pattern repeated at other forts throughout siege. German defensive doctrine at Königsberg emphasized elastic defense with multiple fallback positions. When outer forts became untenable, defenders would retreat to secondary positions closer to city center. This doctrine theoretically allowed garrison to trade space for time and casualties inflicted on attackers. However, elastic defense requires mobility and reserves to counterattack Soviet breakthroughs. Königsberg garrison lacked both. German forces were largely static, tied to fixed positions. Reserves were minimal and could not significantly affect battle's course. Elastic defense doctrine, designed for mobile warfare on open terrain, proved less effective in urban fortress siege. Soviet operational planning for Königsberg siege demonstrated sophisticated understanding of combined arms warfare. Soviet command coordinated multiple arms and services effectively. Artillery provided overwhelming fire support, Air Force dominated skies and provided close air support, infantry conducted assault operations, engineers breached fortifications, and logistics sustained operations despite difficult supply situation. Soviet planning also incorporated lessons from earlier urban sieges including Stalingrad and Budapest. Soviet commanders avoided frontal assaults against strongest defenses when possible, instead isolating strongpoints and reducing them methodically. Soviet willingness to accept time-consuming systematic approach rather than costly frontal assaults demonstrated maturity of Soviet operational art by war's end. The Baltic Sea naval dimension of Königsberg siege affected both German evacuation efforts and Soviet offensive operations. German Navy's presence in Baltic complicated Soviet operations by threatening Soviet coastal supply lines and supporting German positions from sea. German naval units conducted bombardment missions supporting Königsberg's defenders and interdicted Soviet coastal movements when possible. However, German naval forces were too weak to significantly affect siege's outcome. Soviet Baltic Fleet, while not dominant, controlled sea approaches sufficiently to interfere with German evacuation efforts and prevent effective resupply of Königsberg garrison. Königsberg's symbolic importance to both sides influenced conduct of siege in ways that pure military logic would not justify. For Germans, Königsberg was cradle of Prussian military tradition and symbol of German presence in East for 7 centuries. Losing Königsberg admitted that Germany's eastern territories were lost irretrievably. Hitler's insistence on defending Königsberg stemmed partly from these symbolic concerns rather than strategic calculation. For Soviets, capturing Königsberg demonstrated Red Army's ability to reduce strongest German fortifications and symbolized revenge for German invasion that had devastated Soviet Union. Soviet propaganda emphasized Königsberg capture as milestone toward final victory. Individual German soldiers' decisions during siege reveal complex motivations and moral dilemmas. Some soldiers fought because they believed in Nazi ideology and were willing to die for it. Others fought from military discipline and professional pride, wanting to perform their duties competently even in hopeless situation. Many fought because they feared Soviet captivity or believed surrender would mean death. Some soldiers, particularly Volkssturm members, fought because refusing meant execution by Nazi security forces. A few soldiers deserted or surrendered individually despite risks. These varied motivations demonstrate that German resistance, while appearing monolithic from outside, represented complex mix of ideology, fear, duty, and survival instinct. The treatment of German prisoners after Königsberg's surrender varied depending on multiple factors. Wehrmacht soldiers generally were treated according to Geneva Conventions regarding prisoners of war, though conditions in Soviet POW camps were harsh and mortality rates were high. SS personnel faced harsher treatment, with many tried for war crimes. Volkssturm members were sometimes released relatively quickly as they were not considered regular military. General Lasch and other senior officers were imprisoned in Soviet Union until 1955, when remaining German POWs were repatriated to West Germany. Some German prisoners died in captivity from disease, malnutrition, or harsh conditions. Those who survived and returned to Germany carried physical and psychological scars from imprisonment. Königsberg siege's influence on post-war German-Soviet relations was significant. For West Germans, Königsberg represented loss of eastern territories and tragedy of German civilians who died or were expelled. Königsberg became symbol of Soviet aggression and territorial seizure. For East Germans under Soviet occupation, Königsberg was portrayed as just punishment for Nazi Germany's crimes and inevitable consequence of German defeat. Soviet Union maintained that annexation of Königsberg and East Prussia was legitimate consequence of German aggression and compensation for Soviet suffering during war. This disagreement about Königsberg's status complicated German-Soviet relations throughout Cold War. The reconstruction of Kaliningrad after war demonstrated Soviet priorities and policies. Soviet authorities rebuilt city as Soviet settlement rather than restoring German character. New construction followed Soviet architectural styles with emphasis on functionality over aesthetics. Streets were widened to accommodate Soviet urban planning principles. Soviet monuments and memorials replaced German ones. Few German buildings were restored. Most were demolished and replaced with Soviet structures. Kaliningrad's transformation from German Königsberg to Soviet Kaliningrad was deliberate policy to erase German heritage and establish Soviet identity. Modern historical research on Königsberg siege has benefited from opening of Soviet archives after Cold War's end. Researchers have accessed Soviet military records detailing operational planning, casualty figures, and tactical decisions. These records have allowed more accurate understanding of Soviet operations and motivations. German records from siege were less complete, as many were destroyed during fighting or lost in retreat. Survivors' memoirs and testimonies have provided personal perspectives on siege. Archaeological work in modern Kaliningrad has uncovered physical evidence of siege, including unexploded ordnance, defensive positions, and civilian shelters. Königsberg siege's lessons for modern military operations remain relevant. Urban warfare against fortified positions requires overwhelming force, extensive logistics, and willingness to accept casualties. Static fortifications, no matter how strong, cannot withstand determined combined arms assault. Defending cities requires mobile reserves and sustainable logistics, both of which Königsberg lacked. Civilian populations in siege situations suffer disproportionately and require protection that military operations often cannot provide. These lessons have influenced modern military doctrine and urban warfare planning. The ethical questions raised by Königsberg's siege deserve consideration. Was Lasch morally obligated to surrender earlier to save more lives, or was he bound by military oath to obey Hitler's orders? Were Soviet forces justified in destroying historic city to eliminate military resistance? Should German authorities have evacuated civilians earlier despite Nazi orders forbidding it? Could garrison have broken out successfully if attempt had been made earlier? These questions have no simple answers, but reflect moral complexity of siege warfare, where military necessity, civilian welfare, and individual conscience often conflict. The comparison between Lasch's decision and similar decisions by other German commanders reveals range of responses to hopeless situations. Some commanders, like Paulus at Stalingrad, obeyed Hitler's orders completely and never surrendered until resistance was impossible. Others, like Rommel in France, contemplated defying Hitler, but ultimately did not. Lasch occupied middle ground. He obeyed orders as long as possible, but surrendered when he judged that further resistance served no purpose except killing civilians. Historical judgment generally views Lasch's decision favorably as choosing humanity over blind obedience. Königsberg's fort system, which failed to save city, ironically survived siege better than city itself. Many forts' concrete structures proved so durable that they could not be demolished easily even after siege ended. Several forts survive today in various conditions. Some have been converted to museums or storage facilities. Others remain abandoned ruins. Some have been incorporated into Soviet-Russian military installations. These surviving forts serve as physical reminders of siege and monuments to those who fought and died in them. The environmental damage from Königsberg siege was extensive and long-lasting. Artillery bombardment contaminated soil with explosives residue and toxic chemicals. Destroyed industrial facilities released pollutants. Bodies of thousands of humans and animals decomposed in ruins, creating health hazards. Destroyed sewage systems contaminated water supplies. Cleanup required years, and some environmental damage persisted for decades. Unexploded ordnance from siege still occasionally is discovered during construction projects in modern Kaliningrad, requiring careful disposal. Königsberg siege's place in collective memory differs among nations. For Russians, Königsberg-Kaliningrad represents legitimate Soviet victory and compensation for German aggression. For Germans, particularly those whose families came from East Prussia, Königsberg represents loss and tragedy. For Poles and Lithuanians, Königsberg's fate was part of larger regional transformation that saw borders redrawn and populations moved. These different memories reflect how same historical events are interpreted differently based on national perspectives and experiences. The 84 days of Königsberg siege encapsulate everything tragic about final months of World War II in Europe. Unnecessary defensive battle fought for symbolic reasons rather than strategic necessity. Fortress city whose defenses could not save it. General who chose humanity over orders and was condemned for it. Civilians who should have been evacuated suffering and dying in siege. Cultural heritage destroyed. 7 centuries of history ended. 130,000 defenders reduced to 25,000 effectives. 42,000 German casualties. 20,000 Soviet casualties. 25,000 civilian deaths. 90% city destruction. Amber Room lost forever. Königsberg became Kaliningrad. Prussia ended. This was price of Hitler's fanatical demands and Soviet determination to eliminate Nazi Germany completely regardless of cost. Those who experienced Königsberg's siege carried memories and scars for the remainder of their lives. Their experiences deserve preservation not as glorification of war, but as testimony to its horror and warning that ideological rigidity leads to catastrophic human suffering. Königsberg siege was preventable tragedy that serves as historical lesson about costs of refusing to acknowledge when wars are lost, and when continuing to fight serves no purpose except satisfying political ideology. The fortress fell, the city died, Prussia ended, and thousands perished for nothing. May their sacrifice never be forgotten, and may such sieges never occur again. The specific details of how Soviet forces coordinated artillery, air power, and ground assault during final April attack reveal sophisticated combined arms operations. Soviet artillery bombardment on April 6 was not random saturation, but carefully coordinated fire plan. Different artillery units were assigned specific targets. Heavy guns targeted fort structures, medium artillery fired on defensive positions, mortars suppressed infantry positions, and rocket launchers created psychological effect. Artillery observers directed fire in real time, adjusting aim based on observed results. When barrage lifted, assault aircraft immediately struck remaining strongpoints with bombs and rockets. Then infantry advanced under cover of continued artillery support, with guns firing just ahead of advancing troops. This coordination required extensive planning and reliable communications, demonstrating Soviet mastery of combined arms warfare achieved through painful experience earlier in war. The logistical challenge of sustaining Königsberg's siege while simultaneously advancing toward Berlin required enormous Soviet effort. Soviet logistics system had to supply 3rd Belarusian Front, besieging Königsberg while also supporting 1st and 2nd Belarusian fronts, advancing through Poland and Germany toward Berlin. Thousands of tons of ammunition, fuel, and supplies moved westward daily over damaged infrastructure and through territories still containing German resistance. Soviet logistics personnel rebuilt bridges, repaired railways, and organized convoy systems to maintain flow of supplies. That Soviet forces succeeded in sustaining multiple simultaneous major operations demonstrated transformation of Soviet logistics from crude system of 1941 to sophisticated organization capable of supporting modern mechanized warfare. The civilian experience in Königsberg during final weeks before surrender was nightmarish in ways difficult to comprehend. Approximately 110,000 civilians were trapped with no possibility of escape. Food supplies had been exhausted weeks earlier, and civilians survived on minimal rations or whatever could be scavenged from ruins. Water sources were contaminated or destroyed, forcing civilians to drink unsafe water that spread disease. Shelter was primitive, with families crowded into cellars that provided minimal protection from bombardment and no protection from cold. Sanitation was non-existent, creating health crisis. Children, elderly and sick died in large numbers from malnutrition, disease and exposure. Bodies could not be buried properly and decomposed in ruins. Civilians who emerged from shelters risked being killed by bombardment or caught in combat. When Soviet forces finally captured city, many civilians were so weakened by months of privation that they could barely stand. The moral complexity of soldiers' choices during Königsberg's siege deserves recognition. German soldiers who fought to end faced impossible situation. Obedience to orders meant likely death in hopeless battle, but disobedience risked execution and endangered families back in Germany. Many soldiers genuinely believed they were doing their duty by defending Germany against Soviet invasion they had been taught to fear. Others fought because surrender seemed more dangerous than continued resistance. Some soldiers attempted to protect civilians within their sectors, sharing rations and providing shelter when possible. Individual acts of humanity occurred alongside brutal combat, demonstrating that even in terrible circumstances, some people maintained moral compass. Soviet soldiers' perspective on Königsberg's siege reflected war weariness combined with determination to finish war. By April 1945, Soviet troops had been fighting for years and wanted war to end. Königsberg's siege was frustrating delay when Berlin and final victory seemed close. However, Soviet soldiers understood importance of eliminating German resistance thoroughly to prevent future German aggression. Soviet accounts describe respect for German defenders' courage and skill while maintaining hatred for Nazi ideology. Soviet soldiers were motivated by memory of German atrocities in Soviet Union and desire to ensure Germany could never threaten Soviet Union again. The aftermath of Königsberg's siege for surviving civilians involved additional trauma during Soviet occupation. Soviet soldiers engaged in widespread looting of civilian property, taking valuables, food, and anything useful. Sexual violence against German women was common despite official prohibitions. Many civilians were arrested and deported to Soviet Union as forced laborers. German civilians who remained in Königsberg after war faced discrimination and eventual expulsion. Few German civilians from Königsberg ever returned to see their former home. Those who did visit modern Kaliningrad often found city so changed that they could barely recognize places they remembered. General Lash's post-war life reflected consequences of his decision to surrender. After 10 years' imprisonment in Soviet Union, Lash was repatriated to West Germany in 1955. He lived quietly, avoiding publicity and writing memoirs defending his decision to surrender Königsberg. Lash argued that he had saved thousands of lives by surrendering when further resistance was futile. Some German veterans criticized Lash for surrendering, while others praised his humanity. West German government did not prosecute Lash, implicitly accepting that his decision was justified by circumstances. Lash died in 1971, maintaining until end that surrendering Königsberg had been correct decision. The transformation of Königsberg into Kaliningrad represents one of most complete urban transformations in history. Within 2 decades, German city with 700 years of history became Soviet city with Russian character. Street names were changed from German to Russian. German monuments were demolished and replaced with Soviet memorials. German architectural heritage was systematically destroyed. Population was entirely replaced. German language disappeared completely. Even physical geography changed, as some areas were reconfigured for Soviet urban planning. Modern Kaliningrad bears almost no resemblance to pre-war Königsberg, making it difficult for those familiar with historical city to recognize anything from past. Königsberg's siege stands as final major fortress battle of World War II and perhaps last of its kind in warfare. Modern warfare's evolution since 1945 has made fortress sieges largely obsolete. Nuclear weapons make concentrating forces in static positions suicidal. Precision-guided munitions allow attacking forces to destroy fortifications without prolonged sieges. Modern warfare emphasizes mobility and maneuver rather than static defense. Königsberg's siege demonstrated that even strongest fortifications cannot save cities when attackers possess overwhelming force and willingness to accept casualties. This lesson has influenced military thinking worldwide, and contributed to abandonment of fortress-based defense strategies. The human cost of Königsberg's siege measured in individual tragedies. Young German soldiers who died defending doomed position. Soviet soldiers killed capturing city that would fall anyway within weeks. Civilians who starved in cellars while armies fought above them. Families separated forever when some fled west, while others remained and were killed or expelled. Cultural treasures destroyed that represented centuries of human achievement. Amber room lost that symbolized artistic beauty consumed by war's chaos. Each of 42,000 German casualties was person with hopes, fears, and loved ones. Each of 20,000 Soviet casualties left family grieving their loss. Each of 25,000 civilian deaths was human being whose life was cut short by war they did not start and siege they could not escape. Statistics cannot capture scale of individual suffering, but together these losses represent tragedy of massive proportions. Königsberg siege's ultimate lesson is about futility of fanatical resistance when strategic situation is hopeless. Hitler's insistence on defending Königsberg to last man achieved nothing strategically while causing enormous human suffering. 3 months of siege delayed Soviet advance by weeks at most, while costing tens of thousands of lives and destroying one of Europe's historic cities. If Lach had surrendered in January when encirclement was completed, thousands of lives could have been saved and much of city's architectural heritage might have survived. But Hitler's ideology valued symbolic resistance over human life, and soldiers bound by military oath felt compelled to obey even when orders were militarily and morally wrong. This dynamic of ideology, trumping reason, is Königsberg siege's enduring cautionary lesson for all who study war and history.